Welcome to another and also final Village Torah portion discussion here with me, your host, Rabbi Drew. And yes, you might have caught that I did just say final. It is the 94th and final such Torah portion discussion in the series. And yes, 4 of them were done with our TJF intern, Emily. So really, this is the 90th. But overall, we've this is the 94th and final. So we are, of course, going to be transitioning this into in-person Torah portion discussions, which will be hopefully taking place in the deli. We'll see where we change around to. But let's talk Torah, and we can get back to this at the end. So this week's Torah portion is Hayyei Sarah. Translates to, well, it's actually a good question, because most literally, it translates to Sarah's life. It's a euphemism that Sarah, Abraham's wife, has passed away. But there is some contention as to how exactly do we translate it, because it sounds a lot not like Sarah's life, but Sarah's lives. So here is the verse. Sarah's lifetime, the span of Sarah's life, came to 127 years. Turns out there is somewhat of a disagreement as to how do we understand these words. Hayyei Sarah is, now look, between you and me, it's Sarah's life, her lifetime. But we then encounter a really fascinating comment by Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, drawing upon the Midrash, whereupon he writes, therefore, the reason the word Shana was written, the reason the word years is written at every term, and actually what he is pointing out, if we return to the Hebrew, yes, in English it's 127 years, but the Hebrew seems to be drawn out here. When we look at the verse, it seems actually quite broken down. V'hiyu Hayyei Sarah, Sarah's life, Mea Shana, 100 years, Ve'esrim Shana, 20 years, V'sheva Shanim, and 7 years, Shnei Hayyei Sarah. These are the years of Sarah's life. This is not typical, or seemingly glaringly not typical. Why not just simply say her V'hiyu Hayyei Sarah, Mea Ve'esrim V'sheva Shanim? That's it. Just put them all together. Why are all these extra Shana here? And actually, the total is 1, 2, 3. We get 3 of the Shanims and then 1 of the Shnei in the construct. So it actually appears 4 times to talk about the year. So this is something that Rashi here is picking up on when he says, therefore, the reason the word Shana, this year, is written at every single number is to tell you that each term must be explained by itself as a complete number. At the age of 100, she was as a woman of 20 as regards sin. For just as at the age of 21 may regard her as having never sinned, since she had not then reached the age when she was subject to punishment, so too when she was 100 years old, she was sinless, and when she was 20, she was as beautiful as when she was 7. This is certainly an interesting set of commentary, comparing the 100 to when she was 20 and 20 as to when she was 7. This erupts a matter of debate amongst other medieval biblical rabbi commentators. They said the word life, chaim, it's always encountered in the plural. We never find it in the singular. Hebrew usually first lists the larger numbers and then the smaller ones, but we also find the opposite. An example being Scripture's enumeration of Jacob's years. We also have Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman. He says this, so he quotes Rashi, and then he says, and then he mentions what we just read that Rashi said, and then he said Rashi wrote similarly on the verse the years of Abraham's life, which we will, spoiler alert, encounter at the end of this week's Torah portion. Now Ramban continues, having recounted what Rashi wrote. However, this exegesis of his is not correct. In the case of the verse, the years of the life of Yishmael, it is stated exactly as in the verse, the years of Abraham's life. Whereas these years of Yishmael were not all equally good, since Yishmael was wicked in his early years, and only in the end did he repent of his evil ways. Furthermore, The repetition of the word year at every term would seem to indicate an intent to distinguish between them, and thus should not be interpreted to imply equality. Rather, the use of the word shana, year, and shanim, years, in this instance is the customary usage of the Hebrew language, while that which the rabbis have said in Bereshit Rabbah. This is a significant compendium of midrashim, of biblical or rabbinic narrative expansion of biblical texts. At the age of 100, she was as a woman of 20 as regards sin, is an interpretation which they derived only from the redundant expression, the years of the life of Sarah, which includes them all and equates them. The rabbis would not make a similar interpretation of the verse concerning Abraham, since in his case, scripture does not conclude with a similar comprehensive expression. Clearly, this is something that stands out, and they're trying to compare. As it turns out, we don't have to look all around the Torah. These are all within this week's Torah portion, because what we later see following Sarah's death, Abraham then buries her and then really tries to find a wife for their son, Isaac. And that's really what it's all about, especially the way it positions it. Not just Abraham has lost a wife, which he has and clearly distraught, but also finding a woman really to be in Isaac's life again. And so they do some matchmaking, find a wife for him. Now, I want to look ahead also. We're not just going to stick with Sarah. Sarah is important, certainly. This is the end of her life. And now we're going to move on for some other lives ending. We see much later on. This is at the end of the Torah portion. I should say towards the end, not yet the end, but towards the end. Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. We don't read a lot, or we're not given a lot to read about Keturah and their relationship, but as we see here, she bore him Zimran, Yokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Okay, so there is all this story. So much ink is spilled about Abraham having Isaac with Sarah, Ishmael with Hagar, so much. And just in a few sentences here, we see he takes another wife, 6 kids, and we get a verse out of this. Next few verses talk about their kids, so we get a little genealogy. Really fascinating, contrasting everything taking place between Abraham and Sarah, especially with their seeking progeny here. It's almost an afterthought. It really is. Oh, by the way, he also takes another woman as a wife and a half dozen kids. Okay. And then we're getting closer and closer to the end of this week's Torah portion. It says, Ve'ela yemei shnei Hayyei Avraham. This was the total span of Abraham's life. These are I'm going to look at the Hebrew, and literally, these are the days of the years of the life of Abraham. Asher chai, that he had lived. Ma'at shana, 100 years. V'shivim shana, 70 years. V'chamesh shanim, and 5 years. So we see, as it turns out, there's a little bit of a poetic similarity here. It seems to be, again, drawn out 100 years and 70 years and 5 years instead of what we would expect more typically to have been 175. Why draw it out? And that is something that we saw a little bit earlier with the commentaries, the disagreements amongst these medieval biblical Jewish commentators. But so he lasted, so Hayyei Avraham, Shnei Hayyei Avraham. Okay, 175 years. And Abraham breathed his last, dying at a good, ripe age, old and contented, and he was gathered to his kin. So there's a little bit of for lack of a better term, a literary envelope. We're closing off this Torah portion the way we began: Sarah's death, and now her husband Abraham's death. And just as I did not go into it in this conversation, but then after that first verse of this Torah portion, then Abraham seeks out, finds a place to provide a proper burial for Sarah, as well as to also mourn the loss of Sarah. So then we see, this is quite fascinating. I have for many, many, many years, probably over a decade and a half, been really fascinated by this line. Abraham's sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, facing Mamre, the field that Abraham had bought from the Hittim. There Abraham was buried, and Sarah his wife, which takes place earlier in this week's Torah portion. Now, this I always find super incredibly fascinating. How did they know that Abraham died? Clearly, Isaac retained a relationship with Abraham. That makes a lot of sense. What about Ishmael? We don't really know. That having been said, there is what we read is that Sarah did not want Ishmael around at all. And so it's unclear how were Abraham and Ishmael ever in contact. However, it could also be that following the passing of Sarah at the beginning of this week's Torah portion, maybe they were able to reestablish communication, father and son, and be able to return to communication. And ultimately, when Abraham passes, that Ishmael is able to take part in the burial along with Sarah's son, Isaac, and bury their father. That has always super fascinated me about communication. They couldn't call each other up. They couldn't radio each other. I also, another piece that is really fascinating, this is the 25th chapter. We just read several verses ago. There are 6 other kids of Abraham. Why only mention Isaac and Ishmael, not these 6 other kids? Not clear why they're not mentioned. Maybe it's simply to say, who knows? Maybe on the one hand, they were a lot younger and were not capable. Or maybe they were involved and Isaac and Ishmael were the leaders of burying their father. There are 8 of them, but just maybe Keturah's children were, I don't know, maybe they helped out, but not led, like Isaac and Ishmael here. Really interesting. And then finally, really towards the end, one of the final verses of this week's Torah portion is Ve'ele shnei Hayyei Ishmael ma'at shana shloshim shana v'sheva shanim. These are the years of life of Ishmael. Once again, we get a really drawn out description of their age, and these are the years of the life of Ishmael: 100 years, 30 years, 7 years. In English, we just say 137. I will admit, I have not looked at all of when they talk about how old people were. I don't know that this is always the case. I don't think that this is the style always, and I am probably going to be incorrect here, but it's quite possible this was specially employed for these 3, for Sarah, for Abraham, and even, surprisingly, Ishmael. Of course, we see Isaac has not yet passed away in this week's Torah portion. He remains living. Surprisingly, Ishmael passes away in this one. And does not, it is pretty interesting. Again, we get the Shnei Chai, similar to Abraham, the years of the lives, rather than Chai Sarah, that Sarah's life was this. One thing we have not discussed throughout this discussion is it almost seems euphemistic rather than saying Vaimat Sarah, right? And Sarah died, or Vaimat Avraham. Yes, it does mention they passed away later on, but it doesn't lead with that. It says these are the years of their lives, or this was the life of Sarah, and these are the years of the lives of Abraham. These are the years of the life of Ishmael. This is how many years they lived. I find it utterly fascinating, perhaps you do too, that instead of leading off with their death, it says this was their life. They lived these number of years. This was their life. And that is a really refreshing approach rather than simply saying they died. They lived all this length of time. And oh yeah, and by the way, they happen to have passed. And that is a really refreshing approach when we think about people's lives and people's deaths. It's not simply that they died, but they lived before they passed away. And whether that is amongst our friends, our families, our neighbors, not just simply about thinking about their passing, but about the lives that they led. And I think going back to that midrash that we saw earlier, that Rashi quoted, that there is something to be said about that. It's not just simply what they did, but maybe how they lived. And even though this is just midrash, right, about Sarah being 100, but seemingly sin-like as if she was 20, and 20 like she was 7, in various facets, but also speaking about how people lived. So I find that really fascinating. I want to also switch gears, shift them quite significantly, and reflect back on this series that we have done for now over 2 years of the Torah Portion Project initiative of discussion, Torah Portion discussions here as part of Village Torah, which is this all really came out from a conversation back in summer 2020 out in the hallways with a couple of the residents who suggested to me, you know what, while we are not having programming at the moment, we can still, at least through technology, connect and communicate about the Torah portion and have conversations and have discussions about these on an ongoing basis. And a lot of 2020, we did not have programming. And even in 2021, with various times where we could not have programming, not the least of which was during the Delta variant outbreak, and even more recently this year when we had Omicron variant around and having to put on hold programming for 2.5 months, this continued, this kept going. So this has been fairly pandemic and more importantly, outbreak proof of a continuing ongoing program here at what was Cedar Village and has now been transformed into Majestic Care of Cedar Village. So this has been an ongoing project. Now I will point out, we did have in summer and fall 2021 in-person weekly Torah portion discussions, which we then transformed into the bagel conversations about Jewish practices. But I think this will, post Thanksgiving 2022, work nicely for us, that we have, in addition to our Wednesday bagel discussions, conversing about Jewish practices and other pieces of Jewish life, but now also to have a weekly Torah portion discussion in person. And hopefully that is wonderful for everybody, especially since it seems that we will not really have program stopping going forward. Hopefully, even amidst outbreaks, we seem to be able to continue to push forward and be in person and have programming. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity to this. Sure, we could talk similarly about Abraham or Sarah or Ishmael, that it's over. We could say that, but over the course of time, having had nearly 100 of these opportunities, it's wonderful now to be able to transition in person and to return to some sense of normalcy here at Majestic Care of Cedar Village. So with that, I want to, before we go, I want to acknowledge that all Jewish life and programming here at Majestic Care of Cedar Village are due to the financial support and beneficence of Jewish Home of Cincinnati. Thank you. And with all of that, I want to say thank you so much for watching, and Shabbat Shalom.